Well, maybe as we go through today, you could share some of the reasons for, why that shift came about and how it came about, because, my experiences in most organizations is much more emphasis on monitoring, and there's still really lack of appreciation about what evaluation is and why just a bunch of indicators is not the same thing as evaluation. Just briefly to highlight some of the differences between monitoring and evaluation, and some of this will be a review for some and maybe not for others. As we said, monitoring, is here we are. It tracks progress, against what's already been identified, a small number of targets or indicators. It assumes the appropriateness of the program, its activities, its objectives, its indicators. And monitoring is periodic or even on a regular basis. It's using data either routinely gathered, regularly available, or it's very easy to obtain. And it's usually quantitative, not necessarily always, and we'll come back to that. But monitoring data cannot indicate causality, can indicate why something happened, because here's what's going on. In that sense, you really can't use it for impact assessment. Now, evaluation, in contrast, tends to be episodic, usually, not necessarily external. And an evaluation can ask any kind of question. Question in particular the relevance of the strategy or the program, question the objectives. Also, unlike monitoring, which is restricted generally to here's what our objectives were, do we achieve them or not, we're looking at unintended effects and consequences, which often can be even more important than what the program set out to do, and that they're really critical. Evaluation can address what I consider the most important questions: how and why, not just what's happened, and also why or why not. And in this sense, can provide some guidance for future directions. And also, evaluation isn't tied into any one particular kind of methodology. You can use data from many different sources and from a wide variety of methods. Any of this make sense? Now here's one model. This actually, you're from the ILO. This comes from IPAC, the International Program for Elimination of Child Labor at ILO. And this is sort of one way of comparing monitoring, evaluation, and impact assessment. Now again, this is the word impact assessment. Usually you hear impact evaluation, and often the same terms are used to mean the same, different terms are used to mean the same thing, or the same terms are used to mean different things. So I think it's really helpful to think beyond the terminology of what it means. So, impact or monitoring tends to focus, not always tends to focus really on inputs and an output, because that's what's easiest to measure and to count. Now, evaluation tends to look at, or getting to look at, some outputs, some outcomes, starting to look at impact, what's really occurred, what's been achieved as a result of what was going on, if you're talking about the project level. And impact evaluation is looking at long-term sustainable changes at the end of the results change, such as the elimination of child labor. Now, what's wrong with this model? I mean, one famous scientist said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So what's wrong with this model?
It's not monitoring the outcomes.
Pardon?
Is it not monitoring the outcomes? It's just input and output.
Well, monitoring tends to be that way. Other hand, sometimes you have monitoring like the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, where you're looking at impacts at the far end. So that's a form of monitoring. Now, the challenge with that is that it's impossible to develop any kind of attribution between those far end indicators which you can monitor and what a particular program or activity is doing. So, I mean, that's one aspect. Yes?
I would say that it's strange that inputs and activities are seen as the same.
Yeah, no, they shouldn't be really. I mean, I would usually have inputs and then a separate thing that's for activities, and I'll show you some other models showing that, but yes. Anything else?
It's too linear.
Great, yes, too linear, yes.
Mm.
Things don't just work from just your one particular intervention, just in a straight line. All sorts of other things take place and interact with things. That's a major limitation of this model. And well, what about impact evaluation? Just looking at this over there. Any issues with that?
It doesn't take account of the other factors and the externality.
Yes, and the basic thing, and this is often forgotten in impact evaluation, if your point of impact evaluation is to have attribution in some way, and we'll talk later about what we mean by attribution, and doesn't necessarily have to mean straight linear cause and effect attribution, but it means being able to relate, what you did, your activities, to what resulted from it, which means you need, for impact evaluation, you can't just look at the impact alone, but you have to look at how they came about. So again, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Now, it's proven to be extremely difficult to move from an output to an outcome orientation. And some years ago, the OECD convened an expert meeting of their members, which are rich countries, who were interested in moving towards results-based budgeting and management. And I was asked to provide a critical reflection on this, which resulted in a paper which has gotten a fair degree of attention. And essentially what happened there is virtually every presentation, every country said this has proved to be much more difficult than they anticipated. And because outcomes are really far away, it's really hard to link to what a manager's done, they tended, instead of focusing on outcomes, what they were focusing on as outputs, activities, because these are things that are easy to relate to, sometimes even inputs, and they got really excited about accrual budgeting, which has nothing to do with results. Now, this was the topic of a roundtable discussion I was telling some of you at the World Bank convened a few years ago, where they invited 6 experts from 6 developing countries and 6 developed countries, so-called, to really give their own personal experiences, reflections on their own government. This goes beyond evaluation, just to instill an outcome focus in their government. And I've given you in your handout a summary of this. I brought a few copies of this if anyone's interested. You're welcome to take this, and the handout gives a link where you could download this if you can't get a copy of this. And outputs, they're easier to do, they're easy to measure. And they're under one's direct control. Whereas outcomes and impacts, it requires a different way of thinking. It's not, you can't develop a straight line relationship between what you do and what comes out of it with, if it doesn't happen, then blame the manager for it not happening. Because outcomes are distant in time, they're distant in space. Senga, who's written towards the 5th dimension, which is a really great book on systems thinking, says that outcomes, you can't directly see them or observe them because they always take place sometime in the future or someplace else spatially. So you can't directly observe them, and you often turn the shower on and there's delay before the water gets warm. Well, in the shower you can react to that, but if you start reacting while these things are still happening, then you end in disaster. So they're not directly controllable. Also, so it's a very different way of thinking from traditional bureaucratic ways where you focus really on what's under someone's direct control. Where is this little pointer? Let's see here. but, outcome focus really is critical, because isn't this what government, public service is all about, providing benefits that citizens gain, citizens can use, and what a government does, its activities, its processes, its products, its outputs, they're not ends in themselves, they're only there to produce something which creates some value, which is really what matters to citizens. Or another word for this is being to be strategic, and we'll get into what strategic means in a moment. And this is a very different focus from typical focus on inputs and activities or products, or what Ray Wirst refers to as busyness on what people do. And again, the traditional bureaucracy is set up to not even count what people do, it's really developed most specifically to look at how money is spent, and if you don't spend your money at the end of the term, then you have to explain why not, and you probably will lose some budget for the following term, so the pressure is to spend money rather than to produce results, so the incentives are all wrong. And, this discussion at, the roundtable discussion involved discussion about why it's so difficult. It requires a new way of thinking, it requires instilling really a culture change. And what some of the conclusions there is that big bang approach is to, okay, we're changing everything, doesn't work. You really got to start small, recognize it's hard, acknowledge that things are not going to work right the first time, so you don't want to punish people who try and it doesn't work right. And again, this is something else with traditional measurement systems often doesn't appreciate. If you don't meet your targets, then there's something wrong with you, as opposed to really looking beyond it and seeing what you can learn from that. So, an important thing is really to think in outcome terms. And, I already gave you one secret to get evaluation used, which is to engage the people who will be in a position to act upon it as part of the process, so it's not something that just happened to them at the end. Just to bear in mind a few points, Bourguignon is, I think, the head of the French, I forget, Economics Institute or some such thing, and at the recent NONI conference, which is a network of networks and impact evaluation, he's an economist, which is interesting. He said there's no automatic tools to push a button, yet there's a misplaced desire to put numbers in appropriately in everything. And often the most important things are most difficult to quantify. H.L. Mencken, the great American thinker, said for every complex answer, every complex question, there is a simple answer. It is wrong. And Deming, who knows who Deming is? Anyone? Yeah, he's best known for statistical process control, total quality management, and very quantitative stuff, for management, management by objectives. I mean, he was appalled when this is used for evaluation purposes, because it wasn't intended. It's used for planning purposes to guide people, not to assess how they're doing. And he points out, in spite of this background, you can't succeed in the visible numbers, because the most important thing which management needs to deal with, you can't quantify, you can't see, you can't really put your finger on. Yet this is what we need to deal with if you want to be successful. Any comments on this? And one way you can make a decision, just put your indicators in, you press the button, and there's your decisions. Well, my message is, it would be nice, but things aren't quite so simple. Just a couple other things, and Mintzberg, I'm giving you his article on managing government, governing management, and he points out that the most important things, most common activities in government require soft judgment. If you could get very specific, you can move into the private sector. They're in government precisely for this reason, and this is often misunderstood. And if you don't recognize this, then you're measuring the wrong things, and you end up creating great distortions. And Tukey is he's a statistician. He says, better an approximate answer to the right question then then an exact answer to the wrong question, which could always be made precise. So, the two secrets for being strategic is to really focus on the right question, the good question, and to involve people. Now, moving on to strategic approach to evaluation. First, as I was saying earlier, and this is often forgotten by Rosen Decker, the purpose of evaluation to me, and this is something which comes from Mark, is to social betterment. Now, this doesn't come from evaluation itself, but comes from our work in influencing, improving policies, programs, strategies, and this is what we're all about. I mean, our evaluations are not outcomes, they're just outputs. Evaluation reports are just outputs. In and of themselves, they're not useful, they're only useful, and they're going to lead to something else, but we need to think big, and sense-making is another way of looking at it, making sense of what's out there, and this is where our evaluation can really add value. And again, more generally, the purpose of evaluation is to be used. Now, use can take many different forms. Initially, as I was saying, social scientists said, well, here's my evaluation, shows this program doesn't work, and then cancel the program, then use my evaluation. Well, that represents one form of use of, what's often referred to as instrumental use, which in fact is very rare. More often, evaluation is used in other ways to change thinking, sometimes even just putting items on the policy-making agenda, bringing attention to things, and the use often takes place a bit down the road too, so it's really very, very difficult to want specific hard indicators of use of evaluation. Forget it. I mean, some organizations try to count, how many recommendations are acted upon, but what's wrong with that, anyone?
Maybe it's not an end in itself to follow a recommendation if it's not a user recommendation.
Yes.
And then there might be recommendations that are very small, with a small
Exactly,
scope. You
yes.
just change a little detail, and there might be very wide-reaching recommendations. So you can't really compare one recommendation to another.
Exactly. Anyone else? Yes.
Okay, for me maybe it's slightly different. You're talking about using evaluation results,
Yes.
and in the first place, in most cases, it's underfunded.
It's underfunded?
Yes.
Yes.
And then the people supposed to use it the decision makers who are not really funded well. So I said it's slightly different from your train of thought. I was just thinking, how then do you push it to a level that the decision maker starts thinking about evaluation results, using the evaluation results, putting aside money for it.
Well, I think there's two separate things. One is that you say evaluation is under-resourced, so it can't do very many things. But the other thing is, for the evaluation you do have, how can you get it used? And any thoughts about those two questions? Which they're important questions. I mean, the evaluation is often underfunded. Yes.
When you're thinking about funding only, isn't it again being caught in the input-output trap?
Yes.
That only in terms of funding, maybe there are ways of doing evaluation differently. If you're stuck of money, may, for example, instead of outsourcing evaluation, other ways to insource them. For example, use internal evaluation capacity, either in some central M&E unit or on the field, capacity building of evaluation capacities within the operative departments or other, thinking of other ways of doing evaluation rather than the traditional way. Could that be a way perhaps to leverage still achieving the outcomes of evaluation?
Good idea. Others? Other suggestions? And how do you make the case? In a sense, first question is how do you make the case for evaluation to show that it is going to add value? But then if one problem is the evaluations you've been doing haven't really been addressing the right questions, or questions which policymakers, head decision makers feel is particularly useful to them, well, why should they fund it more? So how can you demonstrate what kind of questions you could ask which would be relevant to them? And then you can make the case maybe for more funding. In many cases you can, if you have the right kind of questions, you can look at least on an ad hoc basis for additional particular funding. In your case, there's enough donors who, if you can make the case, may well be interested in funding the right kind of evaluation. So you have to make the case for why it's useful. And I think if we think through some of these questions, let's come back to that. Now, in terms of getting evaluation used, that's, I think we'll be talking about that, and again, let's come back from that. But I mean, again, if you answer, the first thing is if you address your evaluation questions which no one cares about, then it's not going to be used, right? If you're not caring anybody with questions. So how are these questions determined? And you're going to spend a bit of time in providing some guidance for this, and maybe get up an exercise to think about that and identify some questions which might actually be of interest to these people who don't want to give enough money to do that. So let's come back to that. Now, this is sort of a challenge. You know, all information, all knowledge is about what's happened in the past, and this is what evaluation tends to be. Yet, all decisions are about the future. So, you know, if this is where policymakers need to be, here we are, need to be the future, if you tell them here's what's happened in the past, unless you can make the connection between this and here, it's not going to be very useful and they won't care. So what I like to say is take a future-oriented approach to evaluation. You know, not only anticipate the kind of future questions which there's going to be in the table, but involve a participatory approach, the people who are going to act upon this in developing this and identifying what kind of information from the past will be relevant to them in the future. And that's one way of showing how evaluation can be relevant. So what does it mean to be strategic? Any thoughts? I've got some hints already, and I think some of you have some ideas about this. And what are some aspects of being strategic? Yes?
Strategic, I think, means a defined process of carrying out activities.
Pardon?
A defined process of carrying out activities.
The process of carrying out activities.
I see the importance to plan what are we going to do in your future and make priorities in that activities.
I was also thinking of priorities, exactly. To focus on priorities. Not do everything, but do the important things.
Yes. Anyone else?
It's, actually it's just the same, like it can address what the program wants, what's the purpose or what's the change through the program want to see, and it should be like through all the process. I mean, it should go through that point.
Anyone else? Yes?
I think in strategic there's also the aspect of being holistic. You know,
Being
holistic.
holistic,
Trying-
oh, good, yes.
Trying to
Okay.
make sure that you also look at the various different aspects and the different
Great.
angles to
Very
ensure that
good.
you perform.
Okay, bunch of ideas. Let me see, what do I have? First, I think the most important thing is to, to look at the vision, the large picture, overall direction. What is it you really want to achieve? And this is different from very specific activities or processes or even small projects. What is the large thing which you're trying to do? And alignment, and this relates part of the vision, the big picture, but strategic means doing things which support one another, as opposed to, some alternative strategic can be ad hoc. You do things, do one thing one time, another thing, but there's no relationship between them. Strategic, you do different things which support one another. For example, suppose you're trying to, support small, medium-sized enterprises to invest more. So on one hand, you have a policy to suggest this, but then you make the requirements to do this so cumbersome that it makes it impossible to do that. So you don't have an alignment. It's not a strategic approach. You have various different ad hoc activities which fight one another, so you're not aligned in the same direction. You're going off in different directions all at once. Other aspect, and this is something which Henry Mintzberg is really emphasizing here in sort of a classic book, The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning. And there's a sense of strategic planning as you go and you develop this big binder with a detailed plan, and then you follow it to the letter, which is in reality then rarely works. Your strategic thinking is not the same as implementing a strategic plan, and partly because priorities, the world changes, new ideas, potentials emerge, and things are dynamic, and being strategic means having a sense, being aware of your big picture, so you know where you want to go, but then you can sort of see, are things moving in that direction? Are there some opportunities which might take us that way? If we're looking at climate change, and there's some opportunities where small farmers may be in their interest because it's cheaper to adapt some more climate-friendly procedures or whatever. That's an example of something which can help in that regard. So to really be open to opportunities as they emerge, and as opposed to being narrow. For example, if the lights go out and it's too dark, one approach is to change the light bulb. But is that strategic? Strategic may look at, are there better ways of providing for lighting? Maybe you have the wrong light bulb, or you should have more windows and more natural light, or different kind of lighting system or whatever. It may not be the best of examples, but it's really thinking in terms of the large questions. And too often evaluation will look at, well, how long did it take for this light bulb to be changed, how many people needed to change it, whether, and should we, as opposed to other questions like this light bulb is less than 10 times as long, or there's other forms of lighting which could work a lot better. So it's, if you're addressing the wrong questions, then it's not going to be viewed as very, very useful. So an evaluation can help your managers who don't want to give you money to see that here's a new way of doing things, which is a better way, then you might see some value in that. So what makes evaluation strategic? What, again, strategic is not improvement as a rule, operational, inconsistent activity projects, programs which are inconsistent, they're not strategic. We're just looking at incremental improvements. That's really more operational activities. Is anyone familiar with the distinction between single and double loop learning? You are?
Yeah.
Wait, what's that? Yes.
Single, it's a higher level of learning, or not just to learn a particular skill, but to have this reflective capacity about why is this important, and
Yes.
for what purpose.
Yeah, single loop learning is just looking at sort of incremental changes or improvements, but double loop learning is could question the whole approach to what you're doing, why you should even be doing it, learning from your experience today. So it's really been having a much broader, opener mind, and that's been much more strategic in thinking. And what does this mean for evaluation? So what makes evaluation strategic? And I've said this before, but I can't say it enough times, asking the right questions. A job not worth doing is not worth doing well. no matter how good an evaluation is technically, if you address a question which isn't of interest, then it's not gonna be used, and it's not gonna make a case for why evaluation is considered a useful activity. Yet if you can address questions which provide information to decision makers, and you can add value. And also, and I'll come to this later, the feeling that as an evaluation we need to add as much information as possible. We don't. I mean, management is described sometimes as the art of making decisions based upon imperfect knowledge. And if what we can do is just add a bit more confidence to the decision-making process, then we've added value. Without striving towards, 99% confidence. Now, how much confidence is needed is an important question too, and if it's, for example, involving a major cost expenditure, something with major political repercussions, then you want to have a lot more confidence than something which is a bit smaller. Well, if you try something and it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. But you're never going to have perfect information for decision making. And if you could figure out those people who think evaluation is useless and not very helpful, what kind of decisions do they have, and how can you give them a little bit more information to make them feel more secure, then it's more likely to be, evaluation is more likely to be used. And again, evaluation is strategic by thinking in outcomes, not just in terms of activities or outputs. And again, don't restrict yourself to just objectives, indicators which have been identified in the past. You take a goal-free approach to evaluation. You don't even look at goals or look for unintended effects as well as another way of doing that. And also, and I think this has been coming out in the discussion, programs, activities don't act alone. They always act in a context. There's other interventions taking place. And most evaluation models try to ignore this, try to control for context, control for everything other than your intervention, but that isn't very meaningful. It's how your intervention interacts with other things going on, which is really much more interesting and really addresses some of the larger questions. And for sure it's messier, it's harder to quantify, to provide 100% proof, but that is more important. And how do the various activities, projects, programs align together? Are they consistent with the strategy or the goal? And theory of change is a very useful tool which can help with that, and we'll come to that in a few minutes. And also, because we're hearing about climate change, the results are going to be sometime in the future. A strategic approach looks at, do you have a results orientation? Are you thinking in results terms, rather, or just as well as what short-term results you actually achieve? So, being strategic from a program perspective means thinking in the long term. Here's ultimately where we want to go. We're not going to reach there in the next year or two, but here's why we think what you're doing now is going to help there. Here's some other factors which are going to interact with this. Here's the kind of things we're going to look at to see if we're moving in the right direction or not. I mean, in health promotion, if you're trying to, eliminate some of the problems from smoking, it's going to take, say, 10 years for bringing about change. After 9 years, how do you know if you're 1 year away of making a difference or if you wasted 9 years? And which is an interesting question. And the simple answer is to identify, identify the logic, the stream of intervening activities which you feel need to move in that direction, and test for those some of these assumptions to see whether these assumptions are holding true or not, if you seem to be moving in the right direction or not. So it's not 100% proof that you're going to get there, but at least it adds your some confidence to that. Any comments on this or questions so far? So, yes?
Yes, I would like to comment. You told that what makes evaluation strategy the right questions. How would you explain evaluators' ability or organization's ability to pose right questions? What would you think they are derived, or how we judge which questions are right?
Okay, then I'm going to move right into that in a moment. Other questions right now?
Maybe I just want to comment for this
Sure.
theory of change.
Just a little bit louder?
Yeah, for this theory of change, for us to understand, we develop this program and and we develop this theory of change for the program and project. But for the people, I mean stakeholder that we engage, as long as they don't understand about how the way we think, I mean this theory of change, they won't accept this. So I think we should give them share the capacity building, I mean share about this, then they will agree with us, but as long as they don't have this knowledge, it will be difficult for us to convince them.
Good point. We'll talk about the theory of change in a few minutes. We'll come back to that and raise that question again if we don't address it. But I'd say the simple answer to that is that to the extent possible, a theory of change should be done in a participative way and involve all the stakeholders in it. Because what it is the model of how the program is expected to work. And if you just do it as an expert and decide that here's your theory of change, well, it's just the vision people have. And the process of going through this can be very, very powerful. I mean, I've led workshops with people who've never met each other before, who are working, for example, in an ILO, in the informal economy, in different parts of the world, and really thinking through what is it we're trying to do, what are the issues with the informal economy, how can we address it? Is it a matter of providing better support for people who are trapped in there, or is it getting people out of the informal economy into regular work? What are some of the barriers and what are some of these things? And when people really work on this together, it becomes very powerful. They can start thinking about this because people often don't think about this. So to the extent you can involve people in the process, to be, you get a more accurate theory of change for one thing. And you're also going to get sort of more buy-in and understanding to it, because if you just dump it upon them, they're not going to understand it and they won't relate to that. But just asking the right questions. Now, I mean, there's no, if you want a formula, magic button to press, here's the right questions to ask. Well, I can give that to you, and I don't think anyone can. But a most important thing is for useful evaluation, start with the questions and then adapt the method which can best answer your questions of interest, rather than the other way around, which is what happens so often, that, well, we must use the gold standard RCT, which is appropriate for some questions, but not for others, and you don't get the right questions answered. So again, better, get the right questions out there, even if your answer is only approximate, at least you're providing added value. If you have a nice specific answer to the question which isn't so important, then, so what? Now, how to identify questions? I'll give you a few ideas, and then we'll have some exercise we can play around with this. First think, who are the users of evaluation? Who can use the information? And what kind of information would be useful for them? How can they use this? And different stakeholders are going to be interested in different kinds of information and different kind of questions. I mean, the reality is you can't always address all possible questions in one evaluation. You're trying to do everything. You may spread yourself so thin that you provide nothing. So at some point you have to set priorities for the evaluation. But the most important thing really is why are you doing this? Who is this? You really focus on who can use evaluation information. This would include the client, the commissioner of evaluation, whoever's calling for it, but it may include others as well too. Now, what information would they want? What kind of questions do they have? It isn't always obvious. People may sense they want an evaluation, but are not quite sure about the exact kind of questions which they have in mind. And this is something where, working on the terms of reference for an evaluation, I find, is often not done very well, but the time spent with that is almost always worthwhile, where you just really push people. And what is it they want to know? Why do they want to know it? And you can say, if we were able to give you this information, would this be helpful? What about this information? What about that? And so, this enrichment better. So you really start, helping them be part of the process and really identify some information which is useful. So this is a way of developing support for evaluation and also setting the stage so it's going to be used later. And another interesting approach which is often done is come up with some hypothetical findings. Suppose the evaluation said this, or suppose it said that, how would you react to that? And that's also often helpful, particularly if there's a possibility of some challenging findings coming out in an evaluation, because the initial reaction to a challenging finding is, what do you mean? Our program's bad, it hasn't served us, it hasn't done that, there's gonna be resistance. But if you can help people think about that in advance, so suppose the evaluation did say that, well, how would you feel? Well, what kind of information would be sufficiently convincing to identify this? And I suppose another trick too is, I mentioned that just dumping a final report in someone's desk is rarely the way to communicate it. Particularly if there's unexpected or challenging findings, you want to identify them as early as possible. Identify who the stakeholders are, and then start feeding them some preliminary findings. And do some things which are emerging. It's still early days, you're not sure how it will shape up. But it's raising some questions about such and such. And so by the time you finish the evaluation, you've heard it several times over, and it's not a surprise. They can try to internalize it, see how to deal with it. By that point, maybe you've thought of a solution, and maybe before the evaluation's even done, have changed something to deal with it and say, well, this evaluation's identified this problem, but we've solved that already. Well, it's not fault of the evaluation. I mean, this is here again why it's hard to really identify evaluation use, but that's a way of getting evaluation use in advance, early on. Now, they give you from 3 or 4 different ways of thinking about evaluation questions, and none of these are right. I often see there's 3 key evaluation questions, like what's happening, plan, around plan, little and big at any level. So what's going on? Why? And so what? And which of these questions are the most important? What do you say? The why? Anyone else? So what? I mean, that's what I would say. So what is, implications? What does it mean? What should be done about this? And again, think from the perspective of the users of evaluation, what information they would feel would be convincing. And evaluation, what kind of question does evaluation tend to focus on? What's happening?
What happened?
Yeah. And often in a very narrow sense, just in terms of, here's the objectives we said, to meet these objectives or not. And we'll come back later this afternoon to some of the issues with that. So, this is one way of looking at questions. Now, here's another framework.
If it helps, Burt, in my work, I use a framework of 10 questions, always the same 10. And those 10 cover the spectrum of management areas. So, who are we working with is typically your human resources.
Yep.
What are we working with is your finance.
Yep.
Who we're working for is strategic, is your stakeholders.
Yes.
So why are we doing this? How do we solve the problem?
Yes.
That's your research and development. So yeah, so just to add to what you're saying is I find that a framework of 10 questions are routinely asked.
There's no magic framework, so these are some ones you might find helpful, and you might develop your own, which is more suitable for tailored to your area. But it's a way of thinking. Now, United Nations Evaluation Group, there are 3 questions: are we doing the right thing? Are we doing it right? And are there better ways? Are there alternatives? And again, what does evaluation tend to focus on? These questions.
That's about learning.
Pardon?
Learning and process improvement.
Yeah. Well,
doing the right thing is typically what they describe as the strategic question or the
Yes.
leadership question, and
Yes.
not doing it right is typically the management controlling question.
Yeah. And this tends, what we're doing, looking, as a program achieving its objectives, how's the project doing? Really ask the question is this really the right project? Is this climate change strategy really the right thing? Should the strategy be changed somewhat? Our economic development processes, are really getting at the poor, or are they really increasing equity rather than improving equity? Is the money getting to the right people? Now, maybe we're not doing it right, and that's part of the problem, but maybe we need to think of another way of doing things. And, alternatives, strategically, and also part of efficiency, cost efficiency, is to look at more effective ways, cost-effective ways of achieving the same outcome. So, I think it's helpful to I think this framework is, again, it's nice and simple, but I quite like this, and it's rare I find that evaluations really get at this question, or even this one. It's almost all on this, and so a lot goes back to your terms of reference for evaluation, but most of you are working in governments or in settings where you're developing the terms of reference and determining what the evaluation is going to be dealing with. So you have, I'm a consultant in a sense. I'm to some extent, bound by the terms of reference given to me. Now, there's ways around that too, but you have the opportunity to really make sure the right questions are addressed. Now, who knows about the OECD DAC 5 evaluation criteria?
Yes.
Anyone who doesn't? Well, again, these are some other ways of thinking about questions to be asked, and in this sense, it can be very useful. But these criteria, I'd say, more often are misused rather than used. They're often substituted as or viewed as evaluation questions in and of themselves, rather than criteria, something to ask. What are some of the questions about relevance? What is it about effectiveness? What kind of efficiency? Are these all the right questions we can ask for a given evaluation? I've seen, one case I was asked to review all evaluations done within the UN system dealing with HIV/AIDS, and I was doing a variety of evaluations. Some of these range from budgets of, say, $20,000 to $2 million from 2 months to a couple of years, and in many cases the terms of reference were almost the same. They basically said, well, address these questions, and so it was rather vague, and what came out at the end was really pretty wishy-washy. And again, when doing an evaluation, again, this is a guide to help you ask the question, but I try to get beyond this. What do you really need to know? What information is really going to make a difference, going to really be most useful? And if you could psych that out, and often the program manager doesn't know himself what he wants, but if you could work with him to figure out what they really want, then you're off to the races and they're going to be happy. And in one case, I had a client who said, well, I had a student and collected all these articles and they're in a box there, and maybe I can make sense of them. I should find, but why? What do you want to know? And this is sort of a human resources central unit for all government in Canada. And interesting, initially when it came to me, he said, maybe I don't really know what I want. And from discussions, what she wanted was, policy with respect to, hiring, promoting managers, and what the evidence was from court hearings and the like. He said, well, this approach won't do it, but there's another one which will, and that became very, very useful. So if you could focus on one specific question, or a couple specific questions, that often helps to make the evaluation most useful. Very often I see evaluations, again, I do a lot of quality assurance, I review lots of evaluations and evaluation systems, and some of them have so many evaluation questions, you can't address them all meaningfully. So with no sense of priority. So being strategic is what are the most important questions and really focusing on that to the extent possible. Yes?
Yes,
You're gonna have to speak up. I don't see too well, so if I don't see you, it's not that I'm ignoring you, it's just I probably don't see you.
Just maybe as a guide, how
Sure.
many questions, considering the number of people you are trying to
Yeah.
provide information to, how many questions would be ideal when you're doing evaluation? Between how many questions would you try to answer in one given evaluation?
Would anyone else like to have a go with that? How many evaluation questions is enough and how much is too much?
Can I share something
Sure.
there which might indirectly answer your question? That we've just had in my organization done an evaluation, a systems effectiveness review done of our 4 years of implementing an evaluation program, and so by somebody like you. And
Yes.
the finding was that our terms of reference, using this indiscriminately, had summed in on average 20 evaluation questions, which was, the finding was far too much and diluting the results of any evaluation, and therefore the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness, efficiency, and why you do it in the first place. So in a way I would like to support what you said here, like religiously doing these and answering sub-questions for each of them. Forget it. We've done that, and we have 25 questions on average. It doesn't provide any value because we get drowned out. So definitely less than 20 is my conclusion, and probably significantly less. So maybe 3 to 5. If you want to say that any number.
Anyone else?
Yes, I would propose maybe 3 or 5 is maximum. I think I have reviewed Council of Europe reports, so I came to the conclusion that there were too much evaluation questions and too thin results or information about impacts. And the reason was there was too much questions.
Now, there's no, my view is there's no solid answer which applies in all cases. And you're saying you have very limited resources for evaluation. You want to match the extent of your evaluation work to resources, and if you have very limited resources, then maybe you should restrict the focus of your evaluation to just even a couple of questions. I mean, some guidelines say 5 to 9 questions is about as much as you can handle. I kind of like try to come up with not more 3, maybe 4, at most 5 questions. You may have some sub-questions under that. But more than that, unless you have a big team and lots of resources, and even if you do, you could get lost in all these things. And I've seen certain ways I prefer smaller evaluations because they're more focused. So for small resources focus on something one very specific question, because some larger evaluations will try to do all sorts of things. They get lost. And I've been reviewing some evaluations more recently for the EES Commission. Some of these, there are some others looking at anti-corruption. They're trying to look at everything, and they get lost in all the detail, and it's really hard to really identify what's really relevant and what's really important. So less is often more. Now, I think I've already told you this answer, but how do you develop these questions? Decide which questions are the most important.
Yes, that what are the right questions? I was looking for the linkage or some kind of consistency between the strategic thinking and the questions, and the linkage is making priorities. I see that there's vision before the strategy, and in strategical thinking we are making priorities, and the questions are derived from those strategical restrictions, kind of restrictions.
Identification of people or the higher level that will use this evaluation information on what actually they want to know from the beginning.
What I would suggest, or how, Morton just highly urges to extent possible, take a participative, interactive approach. Now, you probably, some of you might be able to meet with your minister, some of you are high enough level you can do that. But you don't want, you may not want to have an open-ended question with the minister, but there's other people you can do, and what you can do is work out the lists of possible questions and then look at need to know versus nice to know information. What is really most important? Or you can do a priority setting exercise. I mean, if you have a larger group, there's various techniques like the nominal group method where you have people vote on the 3 top priorities and the rest sort of drop out to really identify what are the most important questions. So you can start with a shopping list of questions. When often from documentation or what you know about some of the strategic political policy issues coming up, you may be able to start some of those, but then it's a matter of what information would really be useful. So you've engaged people in that. And the people who are involved in implementing the program will probably know more than you as an evaluator about what they need to know, but they don't necessarily know how to translate their information needs into evaluation terms. This is where you can come in and really help. Now, again, questions, we've talked about that. Again, breadth versus focus. If we try to address too much, then you can lose focus. Now, evaluation can be used for many different purposes, and this can affect, how you focus the evaluation. And, I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but, probably the way in which evaluation is used the most is for program improvement, which is fine. But if you want to be strategic, very often there's some possibility, ideas of new policies, programs, program directions, strategies which are being contemplated. And often when you do an evaluation, you identify some gaps, and it can suggest the need for new things. Now, again, this is one use of evaluation. I'm not necessarily providing the answer, but putting something on the agenda, on the policy agenda, say, here's a gap, the current services are needed, it seems maybe you need something like such and such. And then it's up for the policy people to identify, we do need such and such, and let them develop this, because then you have to get support from others in the system and the like. But even if evaluation doesn't lead to it directly, or say, stop this program or start a new one, at least identify issues that need to be considered. Again, new program formation, can be specific as a needs analysis, needs assessment, but it also just identifying what's needed. And then, we forget decision making at all levels. It's often, although we say we're doing evaluation for decision making, often it's less than that. Accountability and learning, these are what often people say are 2 major reasons for doing evaluation, but they're a bit vague. And if it's just for accountability, it's to say that, money isn't being spent, well, I would say do it as less expensively as possible, because it's not going to be used other than provide insurance. But if you want to learn from how you can make improvement, that gets into some of these other things. Needs analysis. Advocacy. What does that fit in? Does that sound like an appropriate mix of evaluation and advocacy?
Yeah, for advocacy to the government.
Pardon?
Advocacy to government in here.
I can't hear.
Do you mean in here advocacy to the government policy?
Could be.
Yeah, because like what we're doing actually is to, the evaluation is part of the evidence
Yes.
for the advocacy.
Okay. So evaluation can provide evidence which can be used for advocacy purposes. And that's quite appropriate. And actually, that's almost the flip side of accountability, if you think about it. Accountability could, show maybe, I was going to say we shouldn't think negatively, show what a program is doing wrong, but advocacy could demonstrate, if a program is of value, why it is of value, and perhaps why it should be carried on or expanded or whatever, and that's a very common use of evaluation. And to me, the last point is almost the most important, instilling a culture of thinking evaluatively, where you encourage people to think, well, how do we know what we're doing is right? How do we know it's having effect? How do we know it's any good? Are there ways in which we can do better? It's continuous quality improvements, another name for that, but really encouraging people to themselves ask these kind of questions. And that's a way of capacity building, and evaluation can really help with that. So, again, when you're planning an evaluation, and you want to think strategically, think how the evaluation can be used, and who's going to be using it. Now, then there's many different types, focuses of evaluation. Ex ante versus ex post. Now, you gave an ex ante example earlier. I'm sure I thought the theory of change doesn't make sense.
Yes. Very often when projects are shown what to have worked, the question is, did it go wrong in design or did it go wrong in delivery? Where you can show that it was never going to work. It went wrong in the theory of change. So after the fact, you can then work out, was it designed to fail? Or was it, did it fail, simply on the implementation side?
So it's really before programs and before waiting for a program to have been implemented and say at the end, well, the program was lousy, you say beforehand, well, there's some logical flaws or some needs which need to be taken into consideration in order for the program to have a good chance of working. And that's a form of evaluation. And I think my own feeling is the sooner you can do evaluation, the better. You can't answer the long-term questions, but you can see if they're at least being thought about. Now, these are often confused, process and formative evaluation. Who knows what the difference is? Anyone? Yes?
Process versus outcome?
Process evaluation versus formative evaluation.
I think process evaluation is that which we do midterm evaluation.
Sorry? Okay, it's hard to hear.
Midterm evaluation? Process evaluation is midterm evaluation?
Anyone else?
I
What
would,
is process evaluation?
I would suppose that we are evaluating the functioning of processes in the program.
And so how is a program operating? And it can be very descriptive and be very useful. How is it working? Who's it serving? If you have a new program, is it working the way it was expected to? And most programs don't. And often some good reasons, things take a bit longer. There's unexpected roadblocks, or some of the assumptions which made sense in the project document when you actually start implementing it, things don't work that way, or the situation's different, or different countries have different needs or whatever. So things change, and you need a lot of information just from looking at the process. Now, it doesn't tell you about the outcome or how effective it is, but you can see, if things are not being implemented the way they were planned on earlier, then this isn't to say bad, but it suggests some things you should be thinking about. Formative evaluation versus summative. Summative evaluation is a judgment after the fact, after the project is over, or after the program has been running for some years. Now, formative evaluation, in contrast, is evaluation which is done while the program or project is still in operation to help improve it. And again, if for something which is long-term in nature in particular, to the extent you could provide some guidance, and yes, things are moving in the right direction or seem to be moving, you can very much think about outcome and impact at the formative stage. It's too early to address it. You can see if things are moving along in those lines, or identify some things which need to be twigged. There may be some major issues depending upon the situation which need to be addressed for the program to be, in order to be successful. And this information can also often be considered very, very valuable by decision makers. And it's less threatening than the summative evaluation at the end where you say, here's all the things that went wrong, because here things are still getting going. Now, there is some ambiguity here, like Michael Scriven, I think, said that formative evaluation is when the cook tastes the soup. Summative evaluation is when the customer tastes the soup. So it's at what stage you do it. And I've sometimes said that summative evaluation is evaluation which is done too late to help the program. So, there's different ways of thinking about that. Again, often descriptive information about what's going on can be very, very valuable, particularly for something which is fairly new. An evaluation does that. Strategic, usually you want to go beyond that. But if it's something new, you need to know what it is you're dealing with, otherwise you can't make any judgments at the end. And again, you want to be strategic, you want to engage in long-term thinking, even if you can't quantify what's happening immediately. So now what I'd like to move into is some thinking about the results chain, the intervention logic, theory of change, logic models, all words which tend to mean pretty much the same thing. Now this is it can look very different, and theory of change I think is one of the best ways to really identify what kind of questions could be asked at what point in time in the life cycle of a program. So it could really help identify what questions to ask, and if it's done in a participative way, get some consensus about things. Now this is your classic linear results chain. Now perhaps what's a bit different about this is reach, which refers to, basically how many people are getting outputs, but inputs, processes, outputs, reach, outcomes, impact. So it's one stage, one or two, but what we saw in an earlier model. Now this is basically the same sort of thing, slightly different words for the same thing. You start with your inputs, your activities, outputs, intermediate outcomes. You can have quite a few at this level, your ultimate impacts. Now, here's again basically the same sort of thing where I identify two levels of intermediate outcomes, but in fact you can have multiple ones. Now, this is linear. This is not unusual. This is a pretty typical logic model. But I think I've heard some problems with this earlier. That it's linear in nature, taking into account other things. So a more appropriate version of this might be something like this. Now, people shudder and think about this, and a model like this would overwhelm anyone. But what this does tell you is that activities are going to be influenced not only by inputs of the approach to the program, can be influenced by needs, by knowledge, perhaps other resources as well. Outputs, not only what you do, but take place in context and other factors, maybe other interventions which will also influence this. And when you start getting to results or outcomes, other kind of things are going to be influencing this as well. It's not only going to move towards down your linear model towards the impacts, which can affect other things. So all these things are going to affect the impact. So I think looking at this model is a bit convoluted, but it's I think just helpful to realize that things do interact. That what you do is going to, your program is not only going to go straight here, but it's also going to lead to other things, and other things are going to be influencing this at all different levels, at the output level, at the outcome levels, at the impact level. And the further along you get to this end, to the most important things, the more different things are going to be interacting. So it's important to bear this in mind. Now let me show you a couple models which are a bit simpler and basically the same sort of thing. And this again is from ILO, child labor. And on one hand, you can have particular activities, targeted interventions from IPEC or from its partners. Now again, you have another level there. So IPEC is working through NGOs or governments or other partners who are working directly on children, but what we know is that that's only going to have a minor impact. If really I influence child labor, you have to bear in mind or address the enabling environment, which is the reason why child labor exists in the first place. So there's various capacity building and other kinds of interventions which can affect institutions, policies, programs, legislation, awareness, mobilization, and the like, which can affect children, and also for families and communities. So this is an interesting example of a simpler theory of change model. And here's another one. I don't know how well you can read this, but comes from maternal child health. And here's the program itself, which influences coverage of a portion of the target population receiving intervention, which is the health services. The impact would be mortality rates of children under 5, undernutrition, maternal mortality. Programs influencing the coverage who's getting the intervention, and this is going to be influenced as well by your general context, routine health services, other health programs. The impact's going to be influenced not only by your program, but by the overall context, by other interventions going on. So it's another way of looking at theory of change. This one, again, just to give you an example, this one actually was developed in a very participative way. People working, this is eliminating child labor through successfully integrating children into the education system. And people who developed this, and it wasn't me as an evaluator, I just facilitated the process. And these are people working in this area from different parts of the world who got together. And they identified sort of 4 major factors here: the availability of high quality education, access to education, and training available for children who are in child labor or at risk, and then community participation, and then child labor sensitive policies. And each one of those is broken down to more like this is just one of over here, community participation. That's this box over here, so that was broken down into various factors influencing that. So this is another way of doing a theory of change. So there isn't one right way. But it's really a way of thinking through at the far end what kind of impact do you ultimately expect to see. And here's your initiative over here. And what are some of the intermediate links which are going to influence the direction to get from here to there? Now, many of you know some things about theory of change. Does this make sense? Raise some questions. Overwhelmed you or underwhelmed you or so? Yes?
Well, my issue, and I think that's shared by most people, is that there are various ways to come to a theory of change. And all these ways have their positives and their negatives. And I'm not yet clear for myself if what I'm doing implements more positives than negatives. Because every theory of change makes sense to me if I see it, but there might be multiple variations in the final model. If you would have 4 people using the same technique on a theory of change development, then you probably would end up with 4 different theory of change models.
Interesting, very important point. Now, there's a couple of ways of dealing with that. One is to put your 4 people in a room and see if they can develop a consensus. And in fact, this is not straightforward, because what you are doing is articulating the logic, the assumptions underlining what the intervention, the policy, the program is trying to do. And you go back to the program documents and you can draw some of it from there, but in most cases it's not all that clear, and different people may have different ideas about it. So if you get people to discuss this, very often they can come up with a consensus. Now, another approach, Carol Weiss is sort of a guru on theories of change, I guess she calls it logic models, and one of the things she said is you could have different theory of change models, And what you can do is use evaluation to see which one's right. So if you have two different sets of assumptions, you could use evaluation to check that out. But, yes?
I'm just wondering also about the process, how you get to this theory of change, and as the role of evaluators. I mean, how often is it actually the case that evaluators are there at that point when the program theory is being developed? Or is it not more often the case that evaluators, that's not even thought of, and that the program designers at the very beginning, that evaluators can actually, bring something to the table and the tools, and isn't it often the case that evaluators come to this too late and have to retrospectively reconstruct the theory of change, and when it's too late to influence the program, and how do you make sure that you are there on the very beginning with the policymakers, the program makers?
Any ideas? How do you get in early, as evaluators?
Yes.
Well, many of you are right in the midst of organizations and you're developing evaluation plans. What can you do to get engaged earlier?
Well, if I comment this, you told, so I would say that you are right. Evaluators are coming afterwards, and if the mistakes which are, for example, hindering getting the relevant information for impacts or results, that work should be done beforehand in planning phase and design phase. It should needed long-term intentional activities in order to put forward that program modeling thinking. So you're right.
How do we get there?
It is it is kind of organizational question also in NGOs, organizations, or in state organization, wherever.
I mean, theory of change is a very useful evaluation tool, which tells you at what point you could ask certain kind of questions. But it's equally a very useful program planning tool. In certain ways, even more useful there. But, it's helpful if it's done earlier rather than later. But, it's very few programs really have a final closing date and do an evaluation. Something's going to carry on later, so it's never too late. Sooner is better, but and many of you, I mean, this is a group, many of you are, may have some say about the kind of evaluation activities you do if you feel this is useful to get in there at the earlier stage. And you call that ex-ante evaluation if you want to put a label on it to really contribute to it. I just recently, I think it's on the resources, did a guide for interaction, which is an alliance of US-based agencies, NGOs engaged in development, and this is on linking M&E to impact evaluation. One of the challenges is you're trying to do impact evaluation and discover there's no baseline data, and no one's put any thought into what's going on, so it's really very difficult to do it right, and the secret is to, to the extent possible, build in some of these considerations early into the process. And many of you have the authority and the power to do that. And it doesn't really take a lot of resources to do that. But, if you can't do it, if it doesn't happen, then it's still never too late. Now, what I would say, to the extent possible, is rather than you as the evaluator retrospectively recreating it, involve some of our program stakeholders in creating some of the assumptions. And it couldn't be sometimes you find some logical gaps in some of the assumptions, it just doesn't make sense, and let them identify this. And that can help explain why certain findings happened or didn't happen, or if things moving in the right direction. What I'd like you to do now in your small groups is to try to take the next 20-25 minutes to see as far as you can go in terms of developing a theory of change. And you could basically pick one of your own examples if you want.